A single medical file, buried for 30 years, was about to rewrite history. It lay dormant within the skeletal remains of the Blackwood Pines Sanatorium, a place where memories and secrets were left to rot. The year was 2017, and the sanitarium had been a crumbling monument to forgotten suffering for decades, its windows like vacant eyes staring out over the overgrown grounds. Weeds choked the foundations, and rust bled from every hinge and metal frame, painting streaks of orange down the decaying brick. The silence here was a heavy, oppressive thing, broken only by the wind, whistling through shattered panes of glass. It was a tomb, not of bodies, but of stories that had been violently silenced. And on a crisp autumn afternoon, that silence was about to be shattered by the crunch of boots on fallen leaves and the click of a camera shutter. His name was Leo, a young man of 25 with an artist's eye for decay and a thirst for the thrill of trespassing into forgotten worlds. He wasn't a ghost hunter or a historian. He was an urban exploration photographer, a chronicler of ruin. For him, places like Blackwood Pines were not haunted, but simply sleeping, holding their breath until someone came to capture their final fading beauty. He carried a heavy backpack containing his camera, lenses, a tripod, and a powerful flashlight, essentials for navigating the treacherous dark of abandoned structures. He also carried a crowbar, less for breaking in and more for prying open the stubborn doors of the past. He had no personal connection to this place, no idea that his hobby was about to intersect with a crime that had been deliberately erased from public memory. The perimeter fence was a joke. A sagging chain-link curtain easily bypassed, Leo slipped through a gap and made his way toward the main building's imposing facade. The grand entrance was boarded up, but he knew from online forums that a side entrance in the old laundry wing had been forced open years ago. The air grew colder as he approached the looming structure, the smell of damp concrete, mildew, and wet earth filling his senses. He pulled his flashlight from his pack, its powerful beam cutting a sharp, white cone through the afternoon shadows. Stepping over the threshold was like stepping into another time. The world outside, with its traffic and noise, faded away, replaced by the profound, echoing quiet of a place that time had abandoned, but not forgotten. Inside, the main corridors were a chaotic gallery of decay. Graffiti screamed from the walls in vibrant, angry colors, a modern intrusion on the vintage ruin. Rusted bed frames lay overturned in former patient rooms, their thin mattresses spilling yellowed foam onto the floor like viscera. Scattered debris crunched under his boots with every careful step. Broken glass, fallen plaster, and the occasional piece of discarded medical equipment that glinted in his flashlight beam. Leo methodically worked his way through the ground floor, his camera capturing the haunting scenes of ordered collapse. He was searching for the perfect shot, the one image that would encapsulate the building's soul. He had no way of knowing he was walking directly toward the one part of the sanitarium that had been intentionally hidden, a section that wasn't just abandoned, but surgically removed from existence. It was in a long, featureless hallway connecting the administrative wing to the patient wards that he saw it, an anomaly. A section of the wall, roughly 10 feet wide, that didn't match the rest of the corridor. Where the surrounding walls were faded plaster over lathe, this section was constructed of crude, mismatched brick, smeared with mortar by an unskilled hand. There was no door, no window, just a flat, dead end that felt profoundly wrong. It was newer than the rest of the building, yet it was clearly old, covered in the same thick layer of dust and grime. It wasn't part of the original design. It was an afterthought, a scar. His photographer's eye, trained to see inconsistencies in light and texture, screamed that this wall was a lie, a hastily constructed barrier hiding something on the other side. A cold curiosity, more potent than his artistic drive, took hold of him. He set down his camera bag and pulled the crowbar from its side loop. The metal felt heavy and purposeful in his hands. He tapped the brick wall, and the sound was a dull, hollow thud, different from the solid knock of the surrounding structure. He found a weak point in the mortar and wedged the tip of the crowbar into the gap. With a grunt of effort, He leaned his weight into it. The old mortar cracked and gave way with a gritty screech that echoed unnervingly down the empty hall. Dust rained down as the first brick loosened. He worked quickly now, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and a primal sense of dread. He wasn't just breaking down a wall, he was violating a seal, disturbing a long slumbering secret. With a final heave, a large section of the brickwork crumbled inward, revealing a gaping black hole. A wave of air, shockingly cold and sterile, washed over him. It was the scent of a place sealed off from the world, an unnatural pocket of preservation amidst the universal decay. It smelled faintly of antiseptic and something else he couldn't place, a dry, chemical odor that pricked at his nostrils. He shone his powerful flashlight into the void, its beam cutting through the absolute darkness. It revealed not a small closet or a utility space, but the edge of another room, a room that appeared to be perfectly preserved. He could see the corner of a metal desk, a chair, and medical charts sitting in a rack, all draped in a ghostly shroud of undisturbed, 30-year-old dust. He carefully climbed through the jagged opening, his boots landing softly on the linoleum floor of the hidden wing. It was a time capsule. Unlike the rest of the sanitarium, there was no graffiti, no vandalism, no signs of the outside world. It was a nurse's station, frozen in its final moment of use. A dusty telephone sat on the desk, its coiled cord still intact. A metal gurney was parked against the far wall, its thin mattress unblemished. But it was a single object on the desk that drew his eye, commanding the entire scene. Lying perfectly centered was a lone manila folder, its clean surface, a stark contrast to the thick layer of gray dust covering everything else. It looked as if it had been placed there only moments before the wall was erected, a final, deliberate piece of evidence left on an altar. Leo approached the desk, his breath fogging in the cold air. He reached out and wiped the fine layer of dust from the folder's cover. The typed words were stark and official. Blackwood Pines Sanatorium, Patient Records. He felt a strange reverence, a sense that he was touching something forbidden. His fingers trembled slightly as he opened the folder. The top page was a medical chart, filled with neat, precise handwriting. He scanned the patient information section, looking for a name. But there was no name. In the space where a human identity should have been, 2 words were typed in capital letters. Subject 0. His eyes dropped to the bottom of the page, to the last entry, where a date was written in faded blue ink, a timestamp marking the end of everything. July 1st, 1987. The name hit him like a physical shockwave, traveling from the tinny speakers of his television and striking him squarely in the chest. Blackwood Pines Sanatorium. David, a man whose life had been shaped by a ghost, froze with a half-empty coffee mug suspended in his hand. The late-night news report, which had been nothing more than ambient noise in his small apartment, suddenly commanded the entire room. The air grew thick, heavy with the weight of 3 decades of silence. Outside, the city of Northgate hummed with life, but inside, time had stopped. All the cold cases pinned to the corkboard on his wall, all the stories he chased for a living, they all faded into insignificance. There was only one case, one name, that had ever truly mattered. And it had just been spoken aloud on television for the first time in years. He slowly lowered the mug, his eyes locked on the screen where grainy cell phone footage showed the crumbling facade of the sanitarium. A young man, identified as Leo, an urban explorer, was being interviewed. He spoke of a hidden wing, a section of the building walled off from the rest of the world. David leaned forward, his knuckles white, as he gripped the edge of his desk. A walled-off wing. The words echoed a theory he and his family had whispered in hushed, grieving tones for years, that the sanitarium hadn't just been abandoned, it had been sanitized. That evidence hadn't just been lost, it had been buried, entombed within the very walls where the crime took place. Now this kid, this thrill-seeker with a camera, had stumbled upon the tomb. The reporter's voice sharpened with excitement as she described the key finding. It wasn't treasure or old equipment. It was a single medical file, left on a desk in the sealed-off nurse's station, untouched for 30 years. David felt his heart hammer against his ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. A file. A piece of paper that had survived the demolition, the decay, the deliberate erasure of history. It was impossible. It was a miracle. He listened, barely breathing, as the reporter detailed the file's cover, the words stark and chilling even when relayed through the television. Blackwood Pines Sanatorium patient records. It was a concrete link, a tangible piece of the past he had only ever been able to grasp at through memories and faded photographs of his aunt. Then came the detail that turned his blood to ice. The patient in the file had no name. In its place were two words that stripped away all humanity, reducing a person to a variable in an equation. Subject 0. The term was cold, clinical, and reeked of experimentation. It wasn't the language of healing. It was the language of research, of detachment, of using human beings as a means to an end. David felt a wave of nausea. He had always suspected that his Aunt Sarah and her two colleagues, Linda and Karen, had stumbled upon something they weren't supposed to see. He imagined them discovering something so monstrous that their disappearance was the only way to guarantee their silence. Subject 0 gave that monster a name. The final piece of information delivered the killing blow. The reporter, saving the most dramatic detail for last, revealed the date on the file's last entry. The final note, she said, her voice filled with manufactured gravity, is dated July 1st, 1987. The date slammed into David with the force of a physical impact. July 1st, 1987. The day the world stopped turning for a 10-year-old boy. The day his Aunt Sarah, a vibrant nurse with a kind smile and a fierce sense of justice, walked into Blackwood Pines for her night shift and never walked out. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a tombstone, a timestamp marking the exact moment the truth was buried alive, along with 3 innocent women. He lurched to his feet, knocking over his chair, which clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. The sound was distant, unreal. His entire world had narrowed to the glowing screen. He saw the face of the young photographer again, looking bewildered and slightly scared, a pawn who had unknowingly stepped onto a 30-year-old chessboard. David felt a strange mix of profound gratitude and fierce, protective urgency. This kid had no idea what he had found. He had kicked open a hornet's nest, and David knew better than anyone the kind of powerful, venomous things that would come swarming out. He had to get to him. He had to get to that file before it disappeared again, this time for good. A memory, sharp and unwelcome, pierced through the fog of his shock. He was 10 again, sitting on the stairs in his childhood home, listening to his parents' hushed, frantic phone calls. He remembered the words, "no trace," "vanished," and the name that was always spoken with a mixture of fear and reverence. Dr. Kensington, the Sanatorium's director, a pillar of the community, a man who had personally assured David's family that everything was being done to find the missing nurses. David, now 40, felt the same helpless rage he had felt as a boy. The lies had been so clean, so professional, but this file, this Subject 0, was a stain that could never be washed away. His journalistic instincts, honed by 2 decades of chasing down corruption and lies, took over. The grief and shock receded, replaced by a cold, clear purpose. He grabbed a pen and a legal pad, his hand moving with practiced speed. He scribbled down the reporter's name, the news station, and the photographer's name, Leo. He would find him. He would get a copy of that file. Every note, every word, every smudge of ink on that 30-year-old paper was a piece of a puzzle he had spent his entire life trying to solve. This was no longer just a family tragedy. It was the biggest story of his career, and he would pursue it to the ends of the earth. For years, the case had been a ghost story, a local legend told in whispers, 3 nurses who disappeared into thin air, a sanitarium demolished in a hurry. A case closed due to a complete and utter lack of evidence. It was the perfect crime, leaving nothing behind but the suffocating void of their absence. But they had made one mistake. They had left a single page of their story behind. They had walled up a witness made of paper and ink. David looked at the corkboard on his wall, at the smiling face of his Aunt Sarah pinned next to faded newspaper clippings. He had promised her he would find the truth. It was a silent promise made by a grieving child, but it had fueled the man he became. With a resolve that felt like steel solidifying in his veins, he reached for his phone. His fingers were trembling, but not from fear. It was anticipation. It was the feeling of a hunter who, after decades of tracking, had finally found a fresh trail. He scrolled through his contacts, his thumb hovering over a name he hadn't called in almost 5 years. Detective Miller, the man who had led the original, fruitless investigation in 1987. He was retired now, a relic from the past, just like the case itself. But David knew that this failure, the disappearance of the Blackwood nurses, had haunted Miller as much as it had haunted him. He was the only other person who would understand. As he pressed the call button, the phone's ringing sounded like a battle cry in the quiet of his apartment. He wasn't a 10-year-old boy anymore. He was an investigative journalist with sources, skills, and a relentless drive for the truth. He looked again at his aunt's picture on the board. "I'm coming, Sarah," he whispered to the photograph. "After 30 years of lies, we're going to dig up the truth, no matter who it buries." The voice that answered on the other end of the line was old and gravelly, but David knew that the spark he was about to ignite would burn away the years. The hunt had begun. In the summer of 1987, Blackwood Pines Sanatorium was not a ruin, but a beacon of hope perched on the outskirts of Northgate. Its brick facade was clean, its lawns were meticulously manicured, and its windows reflected the clear blue sky of a prosperous era. It was a respected institution, renowned for its advanced treatment of tuberculosis under the guidance of its charismatic director, Dr. Arthur Kensington. He was a titan in the medical community, a visionary whose name was synonymous with progress and healing. The sanatorium was his kingdom, a place of quiet order where the sick came to be cured and where the public believed miracles were being performed. This polished image was a carefully constructed lie, a pristine white curtain drawn across a stage of unimaginable horror, hiding the cold, calculating ambition of the man in charge. At the heart of Blackwood Pines, night shift was Sarah, a nurse whose compassion was as much a part of her treatment as any medicine she administered. At 32, she possessed a quiet intensity and an unwavering dedication to her patients, often staying late to read to them or simply offer a comforting presence. She was more than just a nurse. She was a guardian. This sense of duty extended to her family, especially to her 10-year-old nephew David, whom she adored. He was the recipient of her stories from the hospital, tales of courage and resilience that shaped his young worldview. She had promised him she would always fight for the people who couldn't fight for themselves, a vow that became the defining principle of her life and, ultimately, the cause of her death. Sarah was not alone in her dedication. Her strength was magnified by her friendship with Linda and Karen, 2 other nurses who shared the grueling, intimate hours of the night shift. Linda, a single mother, was the pragmatist of the group, her cautious nature balanced by a fierce loyalty and a sharp, analytical mind. Karen, the youngest of the 3, was a firebrand, her idealism matched only by her outrage at any form of injustice. Their bond was forged in the crucible of life and death situations, solidified over lukewarm coffee in the dim light of the staff lounge. There were a family within the hospital walls, sharing laughter, frustrations, and the silent understanding that they had each other's backs. This unbreakable alliance made them a formidable team, a fact that would not go unnoticed. The idyllic facade of Blackwood Pines began to fracture in the humid days of June 1987. It was a subtle shift, a change in the atmosphere that only someone as observant as Sarah would notice. A handful of terminal tuberculosis patients, all enrolled in a new, experimental drug trial personally overseen by Dr. Kensington, began to exhibit alarming and atypical symptoms. Their decline was not the slow, expected fate of their disease, but a sudden, violent plummet. Their medical charts, however, told a different story. They were pristine, filled with optimistic notes and stable vitals that directly contradicted the grim reality Sarah witnessed with her own eyes. The paperwork was a fiction, a clean narrative written to obscure a messy and inconvenient truth. Driven by a gnawing sense of dread, Sarah began to ask quiet questions. She first approached a senior physician with her concerns about the trial patients, but he waved them off, attributing her worries to the emotional toll of palliative care. Undeterred, she attempted to review the complete pharmaceutical records for the new drug, only to be blocked by an unyielding wall of bureaucracy. The files were classified, she was told, accessible only by Dr. Kensington and his direct research team. This secrecy was a glaring red flag. In a place where transparency was paramount to patient safety, locked files were an admission of guilt. The Sanatorium was no longer a place of healing. It was a fortress protecting a dark secret, and its king was Dr. Kensington. The turning point came during a hushed, late-night conversation in the deserted cafeteria. Sarah laid out her suspicions to Linda and Karen, her voice low and urgent. She presented her secret logbook, where she had documented the discrepancies between the official charts and the patient's actual, rapid deterioration. She spoke of the sealed records and the dismissive attitude of the senior staff. Linda's immediate response was fear. She had a child to think about and knew the danger of challenging a man like Kensington. Karen, however, was instantly incensed, her sense of justice ignited. After a tense debate, their shared commitment to their patients won out over their fear. They made a pact that night. They would uncover the truth together, no matter the risk. From that moment on, their perception of Dr. Arthur Kensington shifted irrevocably. The man they had once respected as a brilliant physician now seemed like a predator, hiding in plain sight. They watched him during his rounds, noting the way his charming smile never quite reached his eyes, the way he discussed dying patients with the detached air of a mechanic discussing a faulty engine. His ambition was not to heal but to conquer, to achieve a medical breakthrough at any human cost. The patients in his trial were not people to him. They were variables, disposable components in his grand experiment. The Sanatorium wasn't his hospital. It was his private laboratory, and he was accountable to no one. As June bled into July, the three nurses moved with a new, clandestine purpose. They became spies on their own ward, meticulously copying snippets of charts, documenting unrecorded injections, and collecting evidence of Dr. Kensington's monstrous betrayal. The air on the night shift grew heavy with paranoia. Every footstep in the hallway, every unexpected call from the director's office sent a jolt of fear through them. They knew they were in a race against time, needing to gather enough irrefutable proof before their snooping was discovered. They had decided on a course of action. They would compile a complete file and, on July 2nd, deliver it to the State Medical Board. They were just one document away from exposing the entire operation, one final piece of the puzzle that would connect the deaths and bring down a king. The final week of June felt like a descent into a waking nightmare. The familiar, sterile quiet of the sanatorium's long corridors had curdled into something menacing, a silence that seemed to listen. Every squeak of their rubber-soled shoes on the linoleum, once a comforting sound of purpose, now echoed like a gunshot in the oppressive stillness. For Sarah, Linda, and Karen, the night shift had transformed from a routine of care into a clandestine watch. They moved through the dim halls like ghosts, communicating with furtive glances and coded phrases. The air itself felt heavy, thick with unspoken secrets, and the palpable weight of Dr. Kensington's constant, unseen observation. Their former sanctuary had become a hunting ground, and they were beginning to understand that they were the prey, isolated in a place where help would never arrive. Their most chilling discovery was not a discrepancy in a chart, but a patient who didn't exist. Tucked away in a private room at the far end of the West Wing, a section reserved for storage, was a man whose file bore no name, only the cold designation Subject 0. Dr. Kensington himself administered every treatment, barring all other staff from the room. One night, driven by a cold dread, Sarah used a master key to slip inside while Kensington was off the floor. The patient was emaciated, his breathing shallow, his body racked with tremors the official TB records never mentioned. The chart hanging from his bed was a log of his systematic destruction, detailing dosages of an unknown compound. This was the monster in the basement, a human being erased from the world, reduced to a variable in Kensington's cruel equation. The paranoia solidified into stark terror during a close call that left Sarah's hands shaking for hours. She had found Kensington's research ledger carelessly left on the counter of the nurse's station and was frantically copying a page detailing lethal side effects when she heard his distinct, measured footsteps approaching down the hall. With adrenaline surging through her veins, she folded the paper and shoved it deep into her uniform pocket scant seconds before he rounded the corner. He offered a disarmingly pleasant smile, asking about another patient's medication, but his eyes, cold and analytical, lingered on her face a moment too long. In that silent, terrifying exchange, she knew he was aware of her suspicion. He was toying with her, enjoying the power he held, letting her know he was watching her every move. Their circle of fear was not entirely contained. They noticed the way a young, perpetually nervous orderly named Thomas would avoid their gaze. One evening, he saw Linda attempting to access the main pharmaceutical storage, where they believed the experimental drug was kept under a special lock and key. He didn't report her, but his eyes widened in panic, and he quickly turned and walked away. His silent complicity was both a comfort and a warning. Thomas had clearly witnessed things: secret late-night deliveries, hushed meetings between Kensington and men in expensive suits who were not doctors. He was a potential witness, another soul trapped in Kensington's web, but his terror was so profound that they knew he would never speak. His fear was a mirror, reflecting the true scale of the danger they faced. Karen, whose idealism was matched by a stubborn resourcefulness, decided to trace the source of the new drug. After several discreet calls to a contact who worked in pharmaceutical sales, she unearthed the name, Omniwell Pharmaceuticals. It was a corporate behemoth, a global giant notorious for its aggressive legal tactics and its history of burying unfavorable clinical trial results. This discovery shifted the ground beneath their feet. They weren't just confronting a single ambitious doctor. They were challenging a multi-billion-dollar corporation that had everything to lose. The deaths at Blackwood Pines were not merely the result of one man's psychopathy, but a calculated risk in the pursuit of immense profit. The enemy was far bigger and more powerful than they had ever imagined. With this new knowledge, their mission became laser-focused. They had collected substantial evidence: Sarah's secret logbook of patient decline, copies of falsified charts, and their first-hand testimony about Subject Zero. But to bring down Kensington and his corporate benefactors, they needed an irrefutable link, a smoking gun. They believed it existed in the form of shipping invoices or internal memos stored in a locked file cabinet within Kensington's private office, a space that was strictly off-limits. Their plan crystallized around this single objective. On the night of July 1st, they would orchestrate a break-in. It was a desperate, incredibly risky gambit, but it was their only chance to secure the one piece of paper that could prove the conspiracy and avenge the dead. At the time, the Northgate Police Department saw Dr. Kensington as a civic hero. Young Detective Miller, then just a few years on the force, had heard vague, unsubstantiated rumors whispered by former employees about patient neglect at Blackwood Pines. He had tried to follow up on an anonymous tip once, but his captain had shut him down immediately. Dr. Kensington was a prominent donor to the Police Benevolent Fund and a personal friend of the chief. The Sanatorium was considered untouchable, a shining example of modern medicine. Miller had a cop's intuition, a nagging feeling that the institution's pristine reputation was a carefully maintained facade, but he had no evidence, no political capital, and no authority to challenge the city's most celebrated physician. The system was designed to protect men like Kensington, not to investigate them. On the evening of July 1st, 1987, the air hung heavy and humid, charged with the promise of a summer thunderstorm. Before leaving for work, Sarah hugged her nephew David, holding him for an extra moment, her mind a world away. A final, tense phone call connected the three nurses, their voices low but resolute, as they confirmed the plan one last time. Linda would create a diversion with a panicked call from the East Wing. Karen would stand watch at the end of the administrative hall, and Sarah, with her steady hands and a set of purloined keys, would enter the Lion's Den, Kensington's office. They walked through the Sanatorium's grand entrance that night, fully aware of the stakes. They were no longer just caregivers. They were whistleblowers on a mission to expose a monstrous crime, armed with nothing but their conviction and a desperate, fragile hope for justice. The meeting took place in a sterile, 24-hour diner that smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant, a neutral ground chosen by a wary Leo. Across the worn Formica tabletop, he slid the manila folder toward David. It felt heavier than paper had any right to be. David's hands trembled slightly as he took it, the cool, dry surface, a stark contrast to the clammy sweat on his palms. For 30 years this object had been a ghost, a theoretical piece of a puzzle he never believed he would hold. He opened it slowly, the crinkle of the aging paper sounding like a scream in the quiet diner. The neat, precise columns of data, the clinical observations, and the stark, dehumanizing label of Subject 0 stared back at him. This wasn't just a file. It was a final confession, a last will and testament written in a language of pure, unadulterated horror, and its discovery had just armed him for a war. Back in the cluttered, book-lined study of his small house, retired Detective Frank Miller examined the document under the bright, unforgiving glare of a desk lamp. His face, a roadmap of cynical resolve, was grim. He saw what David saw, but through a different lens. He saw meticulous record of a crime. The chart detailed escalating dosages of an unnamed compound, identified only by the alphanumeric code XP4. It logged the patient's physiological responses, uncontrollable tremors, severe respiratory distress, and eventual cardiac arrest, with a chilling detachment. The official cause of death was listed as complications from tuberculosis, a clean, simple lie contradicted by every preceding entry. Miller pointed a thick finger at the page. "This isn't a medical chart," he growled, his voice thick with the gravel of age and disgust. "This is a kill sheet. A step-by-step manual on how to murder a man and make it look like an act of God." David barely heard him. He was transfixed by the handwriting, a familiar, elegant cursive that he hadn't seen in 3 decades. It was Sarah's. He could see her in his mind's eye, sitting at their kitchen table, helping him with his homework, her pen flowing effortlessly across the page. He remembered the birthday card she'd given him for his 10th birthday, just weeks before she disappeared, with the same distinctive loop on the letter, S. The clinical, horrifying notes on the page were written in the same hand that had written, "I love you, kiddo." The realization was a gut punch, knocking the air from his lungs. This file wasn't just evidence. It was a final, desperate message from beyond the grave. Sarah had documented her own discovery, knowing the risk, leaving behind a breadcrumb she hoped someone, someday, would find. This was her voice, screaming silently from the paper. The official analysis confirmed what David's heart already knew. Miller, pulling strings he hadn't used in years, had the file fast-tracked through the state crime lab. The forensic report was unequivocal. The document examiner concluded with over 99% certainty that the handwriting belonged to Sarah. Analysis of the paper and ink composition confirmed they were consistent with materials used in the mid-1980s. The file was authentic. It was not a forgery or a plant. It was a genuine artifact from the last days of Blackwood Pines. This validation was a double-edged sword for David. It cemented the file as the foundation of their case, a concrete piece of irrefutable proof, but it also erased any last, desperate flicker of hope that there had been a mistake, that Sarah had somehow escaped and started a new life. The file proved she had been there, in the heart of the nightmare, right up until the very end. Tucked between the final entry and a toxicology report was a smaller, separate page, torn from a nurse's personal notepad. On it were 3 short, hastily scrawled sentences. The handwriting was frantic, the letters slanted and sharp, as if written under immense pressure. It was a stark contrast to the calm, professional script on the main chart. The note read, "He knows we have the records. We have to get them out. We have to keep it cold." The first 2 lines were clear, a confirmation of their fears. Dr. Kensington had discovered their clandestine investigation, but the final phrase, "We have to keep it cold," hung in the air between David and Miller, a baffling, cryptic command. Was it a metaphor for staying calm under pressure, or was it some piece of medical slang that had been lost to time? The ambiguity was maddening. For David, the note was a window into his aunt's final, terrified hours. He imagined her scribbling the words in a dimly lit supply closet, her heart pounding, the sound of Kensington's footsteps echoing down the hall. "Keep it cold" felt like a fragment of a larger, panicked conversation, a piece of a strategy they never had the chance to execute. He read the words over and over, trying to find a hidden meaning, a secret code meant only for someone who knew her. He felt a crushing sense of helplessness, a 30-year gap of silence separating him from the answer. The note was a cry for help that had taken 3 decades to be heard, and the urgency in the ink felt as fresh and raw as if it had been written just yesterday. He was so close to her, yet impossibly far away. Miller, however, approached the phrase with the blunt pragmatism of a career homicide detective. He dismissed the idea of a metaphor as sentimental nonsense. "Criminals don't talk in poems, David," he stated flatly, his eyes scanning the note with intense focus. "They talk about logistics, places, things. When a cop hears, 'Keep it cold,' he doesn't think about emotions, he thinks about temperature." Miller stood up and began pacing his small office, his mind churning through the layout of a hospital. Morgues are cold. Cryogenic storage is cold. Old-fashioned refrigeration units for drugs and lab samples are cold. She wasn't telling her friends to stay calm, she was telling them where to hide something. Or where something was already hidden. This literal interpretation was a radical shift, turning the cryptic phrase from a sign of desperation into a potential map. This new line of thinking sent Miller digging through a dusty footlocker in his basement, a coffin containing the ghosts of his unsolved cases. From it he pulled a large rolled-up tube, secured with brittle rubber bands. With a crackle of aging paper, he and David unrolled the original architectural blueprints of the Blackwood Pines Sanatorium, documents he had requisitioned in 1987 and kept as a personal monument to his failure. They spread the massive, fragile sheets across the dining room table, the faint smell of ozone and dust filling the air. Armed with Miller's literal interpretation of the note, they began to trace the building's anatomy, the wards, the labs, the morgue, and then they saw it. An anomaly on the ground floor of the administrative wing, right next to Dr. Kensington's office, a small windowless space labeled cold storage, a room that didn't appear on any of the later demolition surveys, a room that had, officially, ceased to exist. The blueprint, brittle with age, lay under the lamp like a sacred text, revealing a hidden gospel. For David, the small, rectangular box labeled cold storage was no longer just an architectural feature. It was a void, a deliberate black hole in the building's history. He traced its outline with a trembling finger, the paper cool and smooth beneath his skin. This was it, a tangible location. After 3 decades of chasing shadows and wrestling with the formless grief of a disappearance, he finally had a place to direct his anger, his hope, and his overwhelming dread. The cryptic phrase from his aunt's note, "Keep it cold," now echoed in his mind not as a cry of fear, but as a direct, posthumous command. It was a map left by a ghost, and he and Miller were the only ones who could read it. The silence in the room was heavy, filled with the weight of what they both knew this discovery implied. Miller, ever the pragmatist, broke the spell. His mind was already moving to the next procedural step, building a chain of evidence that would hold up in court. "A blueprint from 1955 isn't enough," he stated, his voice a low rumble. "Buildings get renovated, rooms get repurposed. We need to prove this space wasn't just removed. We need to prove it was erased. He proposed a meticulous cross-reference, a deep dive into the Northgate City Planning Archives to find the demolition permits and post-demolition surveys from the summer of 1987. If the cold storage room was intentionally concealed, there would be a discrepancy. The official records would show one thing, while the original architectural DNA of the building showed another. This methodical, painstaking work was the bedrock of a solid case, the necessary bridge between a 30-year-old hunch and an undeniable, prosecutable fact. The city archives were a tomb of their own, a basement labyrinth of rolling metal shelves and the pervasive, sweet smell of decaying paper. For 2 days, David and Miller lost themselves in a world of dust motes, dancing in the weak, fluorescent light. They unspooled countless microfiche reels and carefully turned the fragile, oversized pages of municipal ledgers, their fingers stained gray with the dust of forgotten bureaucracy. It was a frustrating, eye-straining hunt for a single document among millions. David felt the ghost of his childhood hope flickering and fading with each empty file. But Miller was relentless, his resolve hardened by decades of this exact kind of thankless, essential police work. He knew the truth was often buried not in a shallow grave, but under a mountain of paperwork, and he was prepared to dig until he found it. On the third day they found it, tucked inside a thick binder labeled Demolition and Site Surveys 1987, was the final structural assessment of Blackwood Pines, dated July 28, 1987. Just 2 weeks after the demolition began. With a shared, bated breath, they unrolled the new blueprint next to the original. The difference was immediate and horrifying. The cold storage room was gone, but not just omitted. In its place, the survey showed a solid, reinforced concrete slab, seamlessly integrated into the foundation of the administrative wing. There was no record of its removal, no permit for the construction, no invoice for the tons of concrete required. The room hadn't been demolished. It had been filled, sealed, and buried under the rest of the rubble. It was an engineering impossibility without a specific, costly, and completely undocumented effort. It was the architectural equivalent of a freshly dug grave. A cold wave of certainty washed over David, so intense it made him dizzy. He stared at the 2 blueprints, the before and after, and saw the story of the crime laid bare in technical drawings. He saw his Aunt Sarah, vibrant and alive, trapped in that small, windowless room. He imagined the darkness, the cold, the finality of the concrete being poured. The abstract lines and measurements on the page transformed into a coffin, a custom-built tomb designed to hold its secrets for eternity. The grief he had carried for 30 years suddenly had a focal point, a specific geography of horror. His quest was no longer just about finding the truth. It was about reclaiming his aunt's body from the unmarked grave her murderer had so meticulously constructed. The evidence was a victory, but the emotional cost felt unbearable. A fresh wound torn open across an old scar. Miller saw the same image, but through the cold lens of a homicide investigation. "This is premeditated," he whispered, his finger tapping the solid block on the 1987 survey. "You don't pour this much concrete on a whim. This took planning, contractors, and a significant amount of money paid in cash to people who wouldn't ask questions." His mind immediately went to Dr. Kensington. Only a man with his power, his influence, and his bottomless resources could have orchestrated such a feat, especially under the cover of a legally sanctioned demolition. He had not only murdered 3 women, he had physically altered the landscape of the crime scene to entomb them, confident that his creation would never be discovered. This wasn't just a cover-up. It was an act of supreme arrogance, a monument to his own impunity, built from concrete and lies. The blueprints provided the what and the where, but to get a judge to sign off on an excavation warrant, they needed a who. They needed a human element. Miller's thoughts turned back to his original, flimsy case file from 1987. He remembered a name that had always bothered him: Thomas, a young orderly who had been on duty the night the nurses vanished. He had been scheduled for an interview but never showed up. A follow-up visit to his listed address found the apartment empty, his belongings gone. He had simply vanished. At the time, it was a minor loose end. Now it felt like a critical missing piece. Thomas must have seen something that night. Something that terrified him enough to abandon his life. Finding him after 30 years would be a long shot, but he was their only living link to the final hours of Blackwood Pines. The path forward was now dangerously clear, branching in two equally critical directions. One path led to the ruins of the Sanatorium, to a specific patch of earth and concrete that held the physical answer to the 30-year-old mystery. The other path led into the vast, anonymous expanse of the country, in search of a man named Thomas, a ghost who might hold the key to convicting a monster. David and Miller stood at this crossroads, the weight of their discovery settling upon them. They had to move quickly, before the powerful forces that had buried this secret once realized that someone was digging it back up. The question was no longer if they would find the truth, but whether they would survive finding it. The real fight was just beginning. The search for Thomas, the orderly who vanished in 1987, was a desperate hunt for a ghost in a country of 240 million people. David leveraged his journalistic resources, running the name through every database he could access, while Miller worked his old, dusty network of retired cops and informants. For weeks, they were adrift in a sea of dead ends. The digital and paper trails ran cold almost immediately after 1987, as if Thomas had deliberately scrubbed his existence from the world. Every failed search felt like a victory for the silence that had protected Blackwood Pines for so long. The weight of 30 years pressed down on them, a constant reminder that memories fade, witnesses die, and secrets, if buried deep enough, can stay buried forever. They were in a race against time, not just against Kensington, but against the natural decay of truth itself. The breakthrough came not from a government file, but from the quiet, forgotten corners of the Internet. Late one night, fueled by coffee and frustration, David used an advanced search algorithm to scan obscure online forums. He found it on a message board for retired hospice workers, a 5-year-old post from a user named Tom G., reminiscing about his early days as an orderly in Northgate. The post was melancholic, tinged with a regret that felt profound and specific. It was a whisper in a digital void, but the details, the city, the timeline, the profession, were too perfect to be a coincidence. With Miller's help, they traced the IP address to a subscription service for a retirement community in Silver Creek, Oregon. After weeks of chasing a ghost, they finally had a location. The hunt was on, and the possibility of a real, living witness transformed their desperate hope into a tangible mission. The long drive to Oregon was a pilgrimage into the unknown, a silent, tense journey through landscapes that shifted from the gritty urban sprawl of their investigation to the serene green tranquility of the Pacific Northwest. The stark contrast felt like a cruel joke, a peaceful facade for the dark secrets they were pursuing. Miller, ever the cynic, prepared David for the high probability of failure. The man could be the wrong Thomas, or he could be senile, or simply refuse to speak, his fear still potent after 3 decades. David, however, was gripped by a fragile, fervent optimism. This felt different. It felt like his Aunt Sarah was guiding him, pulling a single, crucial thread from the tangled knot of the past. As they drove, the unspoken question hung between them. What if the one man who could corroborate their entire theory was unwilling or unable to help them? They found him in a small, antiseptic room that smelled of bleach and regret. Thomas Gable was 80 years old, a frail man swimming in a threadbare cardigan, his eyes clouded by age but still sharp with a deep, abiding fear. When David showed him the photograph of Sarah, a youthful, smiling nurse frozen in time, the fragile composure of the old man shattered. A tremor ran through his hands, a physical manifestation of a terror that had been dormant for 30 years. He shook his head, his voice a dry, rasping whisper. "No, I can't. He told me they would always find me. He said they had friends everywhere. It was a confession and a refusal in one breath. He was not just a witness. He was a prisoner, and the walls of his cell were built from a single night of horror that he had never escaped. David knew that pressure would only push Thomas further into his shell of fear. Instead of interrogating him, he began to talk about Sarah, not as a victim in a cold case, but as the woman who taught him how to ride a bike and who snuck him extra cookies when his parents weren't looking. He painted a portrait of her life, not her death, filling the sterile room with the warmth of her memory. Miller, seeing David's approach, softened his own, speaking not as a cop, but as a man haunted by his own failure to find her. He assured Thomas that Dr. Kensington was an old, diminished man, and that the powerful friends who had protected him were either dead or forgotten. Slowly, painstakingly, they chipped away at the wall of fear, offering not threats, but the promise of a long-overdue reckoning, a chance to finally unburden his soul. The story, when it finally came, spilled out in a torrent of guilt-ridden memories. Thomas recounted the night of July 1st, 1987, his voice trembling as he described seeing Dr. Kensington in a heated, whispered argument with two men in immaculate dark suits. He recognized them from previous visits. They were executives from Omniwell Pharmaceuticals, the company funding Kensington's miracle drug trial. Thomas overheard fragments. Unacceptable risk. The nurses know too much. A permanent solution. Later that night, he saw Kensington leading Sarah, Linda, and Karen toward the administrative wing, his face a mask of cold, reptilian calm. He told them there was a medical emergency in his office. It was a lie. It was a trap. Thomas knew then that he was witnessing something terrible, a point of no return for the three women who had always treated him with kindness. The most damning part of his testimony was what he saw in the pre-dawn hours. A small, unmarked construction truck had arrived, not with the Sanatorium's regular maintenance crew, but with a team of grim-faced men who worked with silent, brutal efficiency. Under Kensington's personal supervision, they backed a portable cement mixer up to a side entrance near his office. Thomas watched from a darkened window as they ran hoses into the building. The next day, one of the men in the Omniwell suits found him. He didn't threaten Thomas with violence. It was colder, more terrifying than that. He handed him an envelope thick with cash and a bus ticket to Portland. "You're a ghost now," the man had said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You were never here. If you ever come back, the ghosts of your family will join you." Armed with Thomas's notarized, videotaped affidavit, Miller and David finally had the ammunition they needed. A sympathetic judge, moved by the combination of the 30-year-old testimony and the modern forensic evidence from the blueprints, signed the excavation warrant. But the moment the order was officially filed, the beast they had been tracking awoke with a roar. Within hours, a team of lawyers representing Omniwell Pharmaceuticals filed an emergency injunction to block the dig. Their legal argument was a masterpiece of corporate misdirection, citing concerns over soil contamination and the historical preservation of the site, a site they had eagerly demolished 30 years prior. It was no longer a question of one evil doctor. They had just declared war on a multi-billion-dollar corporation that was still actively and aggressively protecting its dark history. The counterattack was swift and brutal, a coordinated assault on both legal and personal fronts. David's editor at the Northgate Chronicle called him into his office, his face pale. He had just gotten off the phone with Omniwell's chief counsel, who threatened a lawsuit so massive it would bankrupt the newspaper if a single word of the unfounded allegations was printed. David was officially gagged. That same afternoon, Miller received a visit from his former partner, now a high-ranking official in the state police. The visit was framed as a friendly chat between old friends, but the message was chillingly clear. "Let the dead rest, Frank," his old partner had said. "Some people are still grateful to Dr. Kensington and his friends. You don't want to upset them." The system that had protected Kensington in 1987 was still very much alive. The abstract threats soon became terrifyingly concrete. David returned to his apartment one evening to find the door slightly ajar. Nothing was stolen, nothing was out of place. except for one thing. Lying in the center of his research desk, placed directly on top of the Blackwood Pines blueprints, was a single, small, dead sparrow. There was no note, no forced entry, just this silent, macabre symbol. It was a clear and unambiguous message. We can get to you. We are watching you. The feeling of violation was absolute, a cold dread that seeped into his bones. The enemy was no longer a distant corporate entity or a retired old man. They were a faceless, menacing presence that had just crossed the threshold into his home, demonstrating their power to operate beyond the law and without fear of consequence. The coordinated campaign of intimidation meant to crush their investigation had the opposite effect. It was an admission of guilt. For David and Miller, the legal injunctions, the veiled threats, and the dead bird on the desk were confirmations that they were directly over the target. This was no longer just about solving a 30-year-old murder. It was an active conspiracy, a monstrous cover-up still being violently maintained by a network of powerful individuals. They were no longer just digging for bodies. They were digging at the foundations of a corrupt empire built on the bones of his aunt and her friends. The injunction may have paused the excavation, but it had ignited a fire in them both. They would find a way to break through the concrete, both literally and figuratively, or die trying. Faced with a war on two fronts, one in the courts and one in the shadows, David and Miller found their resolve hardening into something unbreakable. The dead sparrow was not just a threat, it was a confession delivered with arrogant impunity. It was proof that the forces that had silenced Sarah 30 years ago were still active, still powerful, and still willing to use fear as a weapon. They realized with chilling clarity that they were not merely investigating a cold case, they were confronting an ongoing criminal conspiracy. This dark revelation transformed their mission. It was no longer simply about uncovering a historical truth for personal closure. It was about dismantling a corrupt and dangerous machine that was still operating in the present day, and they were now directly in its crosshairs with no one to rely on but each other. Recognizing the legal system was being expertly manipulated by Omniwell's vast resources, Miller proposed a radical shift in strategy. "We can't win this fight in a courtroom they own," he argued, his voice a low, determined growl. "We have to move the battle to a different field." He looked directly at David, his old cop's eyes seeing not a grieving nephew but a powerful weapon. "You're a journalist, so let's do what they fear most. Let's make this story so loud, so public, and so toxic that they can't bury it under legal motions." The plan was fraught with risk. David was under a gag order from his own paper, and a direct leak could end his career and expose them both to retaliation. But the alternative, letting the injunction stand and the truth remain buried, was unthinkable. They would fight fire with fire. Under the cloak of digital anonymity, David orchestrated the first strike. Using an encrypted email address from a public library computer, he became a ghost, an anonymous whistleblower. He carefully packaged the most explosive elements of their investigation, a scanned copy of the Subject Zero file, the damning comparison of the two blueprints, and a transcript of Thomas Gable's testimony, stripped of any identifying details. He sent the package not to a local station, but to a famously aggressive investigative unit at a national news network, a media shark tank known for its relentless pursuit of corporate malfeasance. He signed the email simply as "a friend of the Blackwood nurses." It was a desperate gamble, a message in a bottle thrown into a raging sea, hoping it would reach the right shore and unleash a storm. The story exploded onto the national stage, triggering the exact media firestorm they had hoped for. Within hours, Omniwell Pharmaceuticals was in full crisis mode. Their public relations team issued a scathing denial, a masterpiece of corporate deflection that painted the allegations as a, quote, vicious and unsubstantiated attack on a respected medical pioneer. They labeled the documents as likely forgeries and hinted at a conspiracy by a rival corporation. Dr. Kensington was portrayed as a benevolent, elderly man being victimized by a reckless media narrative. The statement was a calculated act of aggression, designed to muddy the waters and discredit the evidence before it could take root in the public consciousness. But in their haste to control the narrative, they had made a critical error. They had acknowledged the fight, elevating it from a local rumor to a national scandal. While the public battle raged, Miller burrowed deep into the financial underworld that had funded the cover-up. He focused his attention on a defunct Omniwell subsidiary, a shell company named Kensington Medical Ventures, which had been quietly dissolved in late 1987. After weeks of pulling on old threads and calling in decades-old favors, he found it. A wire transfer record for $250,000, a fortune at the time, paid from the subsidiary to another ghost entity just 3 days after the nurses vanished. The official memo described the payment as a, quote, site decommissioning and sanitation fee. It was a lie written in the sterile language of accounting, $250,000 of blood money paid to make 3 women, and the evidence of their murders disappear forever from the face of the earth. The financial trail led Miller and David down a labyrinth of offshore accounts and legal firewalls, a sophisticated network designed to launder guilt. The ghost entity that received the payment was registered to a law firm in the Cayman Islands, a notorious dead end for investigators. However, buried in the firm's archived incorporation documents, Miller found a single, crucial name: the American lawyer who had acted as the local agent. The man had passed away in the early 2000s, but his death was their key. His firm's records had been absorbed by a larger legal group, and David, using a carefully worded request under the guise of researching a historical business article, managed to obtain a list of his clients from 1987. On that list was a name that made their blood run cold: the Northgate City Planning Commissioner. Just as they were untangling the financial web, the national news story yielded an unexpected and miraculous breakthrough. A woman from Cleveland contacted the network, her voice trembling over the phone. She was the daughter of a construction foreman who had died of cancer a decade earlier. On his deathbed, he had made a guilt-ridden confession about a night job in Northgate back in the summer of 1987. He and his crew were paid an exorbitant amount of cash to fill a small, windowless room in the basement of an old hospital with reinforced concrete. He was told it was an emergency structural repair, but the secrecy, the presence of men in suits, and the sheer finality of the act had haunted him for the rest of his life. His daughter's testimony was a thunderclap, corroborating Thomas's story from an entirely independent source. The foreman's daughter provided another bombshell detail that blew the conspiracy wide open. She remembered her father saying that a city building inspector had been present on site that night, an unprecedented occurrence for an unpermitted, after-hours job. The inspector had signed off on the work on the spot, his paperwork ensuring no official questions would ever be asked. Armed with this new lead, Miller cross-referenced the city employee rosters from 1987. The inspector who signed the falsified permit was the same man who 2 years later was promoted to city planning commissioner, the same man whose name was on the client list of the lawyer who set up Omniwell's Ghost Corporation. The corruption was not just corporate, it was municipal, a rot that had spread from the Sanatorium's basement into the very heart of the city's government. This cascade of new evidence, the financial trail, the new witness, the exposed political corruption, created a seismic shift in the public and legal landscape. The story was no longer about a 30-year-old mystery. It was about a vast, ongoing cover-up involving a Fortune 500 company and corrupt city officials. The judge who had granted Omniwell's injunction was now facing immense scrutiny, his ruling painted as a potential act of complicity in the court of public opinion. The legal shield Omniwell had so carefully constructed was beginning to shatter under the relentless weight of the truth. The narrative had been irrevocably wrested from their control, and the momentum was now an unstoppable force, pushing toward the buried cold storage room. Feeling the tide turning, David made a bold, dangerous move. He went to the annual Northgate Benefactors Gala, a glittering event where Dr. Arthur Kensington was being honored for a lifetime of philanthropy. Posing as a freelance journalist, David approached the elderly doctor, his voice recorder running. He asked Kensington about his proudest achievements at Blackwood Pines. For a fleeting instant, the benevolent mask slipped. Kensington's eyes, magnified by his thick glasses, became reptilian, cold, and devoid of all warmth. He then smiled, a practiced, empty gesture, and spoke eloquently of saving lives. But David had captured it. The momentary flash of the monster beneath the skin, the chilling flicker of a predator's soul. It was not evidence for a court, but it was a profound confirmation for David himself. The cumulative pressure finally broke the dam of institutional silence. The state attorney general, sensing a major political victory and facing overwhelming public demand for action, held a press conference. He announced a full-scale state investigation into Omniwell Pharmaceuticals, Dr. Arthur Kensington, and potential corruption within the Northgate city government, dating back to 1987. His office filed a motion to immediately overturn Omniwell's injunction, declaring the Sanatorium site an active crime scene under state jurisdiction. The corporation's legal threats and intimidation tactics had backfired spectacularly, transforming a small, private investigation into a statewide scandal. The fight was far from over, but the path to the concrete tomb was now clear. The excavation was going to happen. The air at the Blackwood Pines excavation site was a tense, electric mixture of diesel fumes, damp earth, and the collective breath of 100 people holding their peace. A circus of media vans formed a perimeter, their satellite dishes pointed at the sky like metallic sunflowers, while police tape strained against the weight of their curiosity. David and Miller stood apart, a small island of grim purpose in a sea of morbid spectacle. The rhythmic, punishing roar of the hydraulic hammer was the only sound that mattered, each concussive blow a heartbeat counting down the final seconds of a 30-year-old lie. David felt the vibrations not in his ears but in the hollow of his chest, a physical manifestation of the truth trying to break free from its concrete prison, a desperate knocking from the other side of the grave. Suddenly, the relentless pounding stopped. The abrupt silence was more jarring than the noise it replaced, a vacuum that sucked the air from everyone's lungs. The machine operator, a man with a face like tanned leather, leaned out of his cab and signaled to the foreman. There had been a change in the sound, a subtle shift from the dense crunch of solid concrete to a hollow, resonant thud. It was the sound of a void, of a hidden space. A hushed murmur rippled through the crowd of onlookers, but near the pit, a profound stillness took hold. Every eye was fixed on the fractured gray slab at the bottom of the excavation. David's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, painful rhythm. This was it, the moment of truth, or the final, crushing dead end of a lifelong quest. For David, the world narrowed to that single point in the earth. The faces around him blurred into an indistinct watercolor of anxiety and anticipation. He was no longer a 40-year-old man. He was a 10-year-old boy again, sitting on the front steps of his house, waiting for his aunt's car to turn the corner. The 30 years of hollow anniversaries, of unanswered questions, of a grief that had no body to mourn, had all coalesced into this one unbearable moment of suspense. The acrid smell of the generator's exhaust, mixed with the raw, loamy scent of the disturbed soil, creating a unique perfume of discovery and decay that would be forever seared into his memory. He felt a profound physical connection to the ground beneath his feet, as if he could feel the silent scream of the story it had held captive for so long. The heavy machinery was pulled back, and a team of men descended into the pit with sledgehammers and pry bars, their movements precise and deliberate. They worked carefully around the edges of the fracture, chipping away at the concrete with a focused intensity. It wasn't a random air pocket or a structural flaw. The clean, straight lines they began to uncover revealed the unmistakable shape of a man-made chamber. The concrete was thick, reinforced with a web of rebar, a testament to the immense effort and cold-blooded intent that had gone into its construction. Miller stood beside David, his jaw tight, his professional composure a thin veneer over the raw fury in his eyes. He had hunted monsters his whole career, but this meticulously engineered tomb was an act of evil, so calculated it felt profane. A large section of the concrete finally gave way, crumbling inward with a deep, guttural groan and revealing a perfect, square hole of absolute blackness. A collective gasp went through the small group of officials. The foreman, a man who had seen everything in his 30 years of demolition work, shined a high-powered flashlight into the void. He held the beam steady for a long, silent moment, then slowly pulled back, his face ashen. He didn't speak a word. He didn't need to. He simply turned and looked at the lead detective, his eyes wide with a horror that was more eloquent than any scream. That single, silent exchange was the confirmation. The ghost story was real. The tomb was not empty. The hunt had led them to the right place, and now they had to face what was inside. A wave of shockingly cold air billowed out of the opening, a preserved breath from the summer of 1987. It washed over David, chilling him to the bone despite the mild autumn day. The air carried a strange, sterile scent, a faint chemical odor of old antiseptic and something else, a dry, dusty smell of a place that had been hermetically sealed off from the world, untouched by the natural process of decay. For David, it felt like a tangible message from the past, the last, frigid exhalation of the people trapped within, a cold whisper traveling across 3 decades to finally tell its story. He closed his eyes for a second, a single, hot tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. He had found her. He had found them. And the cold was the first thing she had sent to greet him. The crime scene unit moved in, their white Tyvek suits a stark, alien presence against the dark earth. They erected powerful, glaring lights around the opening, flooding the subterranean chamber with a harsh, unforgiving brilliance. The light cut through the 30 years of darkness, revealing the scene inside with a brutal, clinical clarity. The first object to become visible was the corner of a metal gurney, its thin mattress still covered with a sheet, its wheels frozen solid with rust. The space was small, no larger than a utility closet, its concrete walls bare and stained with moisture. It was a claustrophobic, purpose-built crypt, designed with a chilling efficiency for one purpose only: to make its occupants disappear from the world forever, to erase them from both life and memory. And then, illuminated in the stark glare of the forensic lights, the full, heartbreaking reality of the tomb was laid bare. Huddled together in the far corner of the chamber, as if seeking warmth and comfort from one another in their final, terrifying moments, were 3 figures. They were wrapped in thin, white hospital blankets, their forms eerily preserved by the cold, dry, and airless environment. The scene was not one of gore or violent struggle, but of a quiet, profound tragedy. A silent, frozen tableau of 3 women facing the encroaching darkness together. Their murderers had not even afforded them the dignity of individual graves, instead sealing them in this shared coffin of concrete, a final, callous act of dehumanization. They had died as they had lived, a united front against an evil they could not defeat. David felt an invisible force pulling him forward, an instinct more powerful than reason, more potent than the detective's restraining hand on his arm. He broke away, stumbling over the uneven ground, his eyes locked on the scene in the pit. He had to see. He had to bear witness. The 30 years of imagining, of picturing 1,000 different horrifying scenarios, had all been a pale imitation of this devastating reality. The lead detective saw the raw, unadulterated grief etched on David's face and, instead of stopping him, simply gave a solemn, understanding nod to the officer at the tape. This was not a moment for procedure. This was a moment for a nephew to finally, after a lifetime of waiting, find his way back to his aunt, even if it was at the edge of her grave. He stood at the precipice, looking down into the illuminated chamber, his mind struggling to reconcile the scene with the woman he remembered. And then he saw it. A detail so small, so personal, it shattered the last of his composure. One of the figures, the one he knew in his soul was Sarah, was wearing the remnants of her nurse's uniform. And around her neck, resting against the dusty fabric, was a small, silver locket, tarnished by time but unmistakable. He knew that locket. It had been a gift from his mother to Sarah for her 30th birthday. He remembered the day she received it, how she had immediately opened it and placed a tiny, school picture of him inside. The abstract horror of finding 3 bodies became a piercing, intimate agony. The symbol of her love for him had been with her in her final, terrifying moments. A sound tore from David's throat, a raw, primal cry of anguish that was 30 years in the making. It was the sound of a boy's grief, finally given voice by a man's lungs. He collapsed to his knees, the cold, damp earth soaking through his jeans, his hands clutching the soil as if to hold himself to the world. The cacophony of the site, the hushed whispers of the forensic team, the distant shouts of the reporters, the hum of the generators, all faded into a roaring, suffocating silence. In his mind, there was only the glint of silver from the locket and the crushing, absolute finality of the truth. She was gone. She had been here, in this cold, dark place, all along. The not knowing had been a unique kind of hell, but the knowing, he realized, was a fresh and infinitely deeper wound. At the exact moment David's world was collapsing at the edge of a concrete tomb, another world was being systematically dismantled across town. A convoy of unmarked state police sedans and a single, armored tactical vehicle rolled to a silent stop before the wrought iron gates of a sprawling, opulent mansion. The home of Dr. Arthur Kensington. There were no sirens, no flashing lights to announce their arrival. They moved with the quiet, inexorable efficiency of a predator that knows its prey is cornered. Officers in tactical gear fanned out, creating a secure perimeter around the estate, their movements a stark, menacing contrast to the manicured lawns and peaceful fountains. The warrant, signed and sealed, was in the lead agent's hand. The time for whispers and threats was over. The time for justice had arrived. The climax unfolded in a powerful, split screen of consequence and closure. One image showed the forensic team, their movements now imbued with a sacred reverence, beginning the slow, delicate process of liberating the 3 nurses from their 30-year prison. The other showed the heavy, ornate oak door of Dr. Kensington's mansion splintering into 1,000 pieces under the brutal, percussive impact of a police battering ram. The profound silence of the grave, a silence Dr. Kensington had paid a fortune to create and maintain, was finally and irrevocably broken. In its place was the deafening sound of justice, a sound that echoed through the marble-floored foyer of the man who believed he was a god, the man who thought his sins and his victims would remain buried forever. The arrest of Dr. Arthur Kensington was a quiet, anticlimactic affair that stood in stark contrast to the violent storm of his crimes. They found him not in a panic, but sitting calmly in his leather-bound study, a glass of expensive brandy in his hand, as if he were expecting them. The benevolent mask he had worn for decades was gone, replaced by a chillingly placid expression of pure, unadulterated arrogance. As they led him away in handcuffs, his frail, elderly form a pathetic caricature of the monster he was, the flashing lights of the police cruisers reflected off the polished marble floors and the priceless art on his walls. Each object was a testament to a life of luxury and respect, a life purchased with the blood of innocent people and built upon a foundation of concrete and bone. His empire of lies had finally, irrevocably, crumbled into dust. The legal case against him was an avalanche of irrefutable evidence. The state attorney general, seizing the high-profile opportunity, personally led the prosecution. Kensington was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and multiple counts of medical fraud and conspiracy. The prosecution's case was a fortress built from the pillars of David and Miller's investigation, Thomas Gable's terrified but unwavering testimony, the blueprints that revealed the tomb, the financial records linking Omniwell to the cover-up, and the Subject Zero file, Sarah's own meticulous indictment from beyond the grave. And at the heart of it all, the most powerful and silent witnesses were the bodies of Sarah, Linda, and Karen themselves, their very existence in that concrete chamber, a final, damning testament to his guilt. There was nowhere left for him to hide. Omniwell Pharmaceuticals, the corporate behemoth that had enabled and funded Kensington's atrocities, was plunged into a crisis from which it would never recover. Hit with a federal racketeering investigation and a tidal wave of civil lawsuits from the families of the tuberculosis patients who died in the illegal trials, the company's stock plummeted into oblivion. The damning evidence of the, quote, site decommissioning and sanitation fee proved to be the smoking gun, a clear financial link to the cover-up. The CEO and several board members were indicted for corporate manslaughter and obstruction of justice. The corporation that had once seemed untouchable, a pillar of the medical industry, was exposed as a criminal enterprise that valued profits over human lives, its legacy forever stained by the secrets buried at Blackwood Pines. The web of corruption extended into the heart of Northgate's city government. The former city planning commissioner, whose name appeared on the client list of a Cayman Islands law firm, was arrested in a pre-dawn raid. Faced with irrefutable evidence of his financial ties to Omniwell's Shell Corporation and the foreman's daughter's testimony placing an inspector at the scene, he confessed to his role in the conspiracy. For a bribe of $50,000 and the promise of future political support, he had falsified the demolition permits and ensured that no official record of the concrete pour ever existed. His betrayal of public trust was a sickening reminder of how easily power can be corrupted and how the silence of one man can enable the evil of another, allowing a crime to remain hidden for 3 decades. The autopsies provided the final grim chapter in the story of the nurses' last moments. The medical examiner's report was chilling in its clinical detail. The cause of death for all 3 women was identical: cardiac arrest induced by a massive intravenous dose of an unknown chemical compound. Traces of the substance, later matched to samples of XP4 found in Kensington's archived research notes, were found in their systems. The report noted the absence of any signs of struggle, suggesting they had been lured to the location under false pretenses and incapacitated before being murdered. They had been executed with the same cold, detached efficiency Kensington had used on his test subjects. The science confirmed what their hearts already knew. They were murdered, not for what they did, but for what they were about to do. Tell the truth. Dr. Kensington's trial became a national media obsession, a courtroom drama that captivated a horrified public. Throughout the proceedings, he remained a portrait of defiant narcissism, his expression unchanging as the harrowing details of his crimes were laid bare. The prosecution built its case brick by painstaking brick, with Thomas Gable's emotional testimony from his nursing home serving as a powerful centerpiece. When Sarah's silver locket, containing the tiny, faded photograph of a 10-year-old David, was entered into evidence, a collective gasp went through the courtroom. The small, tarnished object was more damning than any legal document, a tangible symbol of the human cost of Kensington's ambition. It transformed the victims from names in a file into living, breathing people whose lives had been brutally stolen. The jury's deliberation was swift. After only 4 hours, they returned with a verdict, guilty on all counts. As the word guilty echoed 3 times through the silent courtroom, Dr. Arthur Kensington's placid facade finally cracked. For a single, fleeting moment, a look of pure, venomous rage crossed his face before being replaced by an empty, hollow stare. At sentencing, the judge condemned him not only for the murders, but for the, quote, profound and monstrous betrayal of his sacred oath as a physician. Kensington was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms in a maximum security prison, without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would die behind bars. The man who had played God, who had built a tomb to bury his sins, would spend the rest of his existence in a small, concrete cell of his own. For David, the verdict was not a moment of joyous victory, but one of profound, somber release. He had attended every single day of the trial, a silent sentinel bearing witness for the family he had lost. When the sentence was read, he didn't cheer. He simply closed his eyes and let out a breath he felt he had been holding for 30 years. The crushing weight of the unknown, the obsessive drive that had consumed his entire adult life, finally dissolved, leaving behind the clean, sharp ache of grief. He had done it. He had fulfilled the promise he made to his aunt as a boy. He had found her, he had brought her home, and he had ensured that the man who took her from him would never again see the light of day as a free man. In the aftermath, David dedicated himself to one final piece of the puzzle, giving a name back to the man Kensington had erased from the world. Through old police records and homeless shelter archives, he finally identified Subject Zero as William Horvath, a Vietnam veteran who had fallen on hard times and had no living family. He was the perfect, invisible victim. David used the advance from the book he was writing about the case to purchase a proper burial plot and a headstone for him. The inscription was simple: William Horvath, a man remembered. In a small, quiet ceremony attended only by David and Miller, he finally gave a measure of dignity back to the first victim of Blackwood Pines, ensuring that Kensington's attempt to reduce a human being to a variable had ultimately failed. The horrific story of Blackwood Pines sent shockwaves through the medical and political establishments. In response to the public outcry, Congress passed a new piece of federal legislation officially named the Blackwood Nurses Protection Act, which dramatically strengthened legal protections for whistleblowers in both public and private healthcare settings. Sarah, Linda, and Karen were posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor. They became national symbols of courage and integrity, their sacrifice a catalyst for systemic change that would protect countless others. The legacy of their deaths was not one of tragedy alone, but of a profound and lasting impact on the very system they had died trying to reform. Their final act of defiance had, in the end, succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Frank Miller filed his retirement papers the day after Kensington's sentencing. The Blackwood Pines case, the one great failure that had haunted his entire career, was now his crowning achievement. The ghost that had sat on his shoulder for 3 decades was finally gone. He packed up his desk, leaving behind the cold case files and the ghosts of the city's forgotten dead. He and David met one last time at the diner where their journey had begun, sharing not coffee, but a comfortable, understanding silence. They were 2 men from different generations, bound together by a shared quest for a truth that had nearly been lost to time. As they shook hands and parted ways, it was with the quiet acknowledgement that they had not just solved a crime, they had restored a small piece of order to a chaotic world. David's life found a new, quieter rhythm. The frantic, obsessive energy that had fueled his crusade for justice was replaced by a sense of calm purpose. He finished his book, a national bestseller titled The Blackwood Tapes, which was lauded not for its sensationalism but for its deeply human portrayal of the victims and the relentless pursuit of truth. He dedicated it simply, "For Sarah, Linda, and Karen, your voices were finally heard." He left his job at the newspaper and used the proceeds from the book to establish a foundation in their names, one dedicated to providing legal support for medical whistleblowers. He had transformed his personal trauma into a public service, ensuring that the legacy of the 3 nurses would be one of empowerment and justice for others. On a cool, clear autumn afternoon, 1 year after the excavation, David stood before 3 polished granite headstones in Northgate Cemetery: Sarah, Linda, Karen. Their names were etched deep into the stone, a permanent testament to their existence. The graves were side by side, a final symbol of the unity they had shared in life and in death. He placed a single white lily on each grave, the flowers a stark, beautiful contrast to the dark earth. The wind rustled the leaves in the trees above, and for the first time since he was a 10-year-old boy, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful. The questions had been answered. The guilty had been punished. The long, 30-year night was finally over, and as he turned to walk away, he did so not with the heavy burden of a mystery, but with the light, clean weight of a memory. The story of Blackwood Pines did not end with a verdict. It ended in the quiet solitude of a cemetery, under the watchful eyes of ancient oak trees. David stood before the 3 polished granite headstones, their names etched deep into the stone, a permanent testament against the forces that had tried to erase them. He no longer felt the frantic, obsessive energy that had driven him for decades. In its place was a profound, aching peace, the kind that comes only after a long and terrible war. The wind whispered through the leaves, a sound that was no longer lonely. It felt like a conversation, a final, gentle farewell. He had not just brought bodies home to be buried, he had brought their stories back into the light, ensuring they would never be silenced again. The truth, he realized, was the only monument that could ever truly honor them. The ripples of their sacrifice spread far beyond the iron gates of that cemetery. The Blackwood Nurses Protection Act became a landmark piece of legislation, a shield forged from their tragedy, now protecting thousands of healthcare workers who dared to speak out against corruption. Sarah, Linda, and Karen were no longer just names on a cold case file. They were national heroes, their story a mandatory case study in medical ethics courses across the country. Their final, desperate act of defiance on that dark July night had, in the end, achieved more than they could have ever imagined. They had wanted to save a handful of patients from one corrupt doctor. Instead, their memory had become a guardian for an entire generation of them, a testament to the idea that no act of courage, no matter how small or seemingly futile, is ever truly wasted. For Frank Miller, justice had a different, more personal flavor. The day after Kensington's sentencing, he signed his final retirement papers, closing the door on a career that had been defined by the one ghost he could never lay to rest. He didn't celebrate with a party or a grand farewell. He simply went home, packed a small bag, and went fishing. The quiet solitude of the lake, a welcome antidote to the noise of the past. The Blackwood case was no longer a monument to his failure, but the capstone of his legacy. He and David, two men from different worlds bound by a shared obsession, had stared into the abyss and pulled the truth from its depths. They had proven that even after 30 years, the conscience of a good cop and the love of a grieving nephew were forces more powerful than any corporate conspiracy. Dr. Arthur Kensington, the man who believed himself a god, spent his final years in the sterile, fluorescent-lit world of a maximum-security prison. His wealth, his influence, his carefully constructed legacy, all of it vanished, leaving only a frail, bitter old man in a drab prison uniform. He was denied the dignity of a quiet death, instead fading into obscurity in a concrete cell not so different from the one he had built for his victims. The ultimate irony was that in his desperate attempt to achieve immortality through a medical breakthrough, he had instead achieved it through his infamy. His name would not be remembered for the lives he saved, but for the lives he destroyed, a permanent cautionary tale about the monstrous nature of ambition, untethered from humanity. The silence he had so brutally enforced became his final, eternal companion. David ensured that the nurse's legacy would be one of action. He used the substantial proceeds from his best-selling book, Subject Zero, to establish the Blackwood Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing legal and financial support to medical whistleblowers. The foundation became a beacon of hope for those who, like his aunt, found themselves facing down corrupt systems alone. He had transformed the source of his deepest trauma into a wellspring of public good, channeling his grief into a purpose that was larger than himself. In doing so, he gave Sarah, Linda, and Karen a new kind of life, one where their courage continued to resonate, empowering others to speak truth to power, ensuring their voices would echo in the fight for justice for years to come. The fall of Dr. Kensington and the exposure of Omniwell's crimes was a seismic event, but it was also a single battle in a much larger ongoing war. The case ripped the curtain back on a system where profit often takes precedence over patient safety, revealing a culture of silence and intimidation that extends far beyond the walls of one abandoned sanitarium. The questions raised by their story linger in the air. How many other Subject Zeros have been erased in the name of progress? How many other secrets lie buried under the foundations of respected institutions? The story of Blackwood Pines is a chilling reminder that the monsters are not always hiding in the shadows. Sometimes they wear lab coats and are celebrated as heroes. And this was just the beginning of something much bigger. What do you think? Are there other Blackwood pines out there, just waiting for a single crack in a wall to be discovered? David eventually found a life beyond the shadow of Blackwood pines. The hunt for the truth had defined him for so long that he had to learn how to live without it, to find an identity that wasn't forged in grief and obsession. He found it in small, quiet moments, the warmth of the sun on his face, the taste of coffee on a lazy Sunday morning, the simple act of living without the constant, crushing weight of an unanswered question. He had spent 3 decades fighting for the dead, and in the end, he had also managed to save himself. He had learned that closure isn't an ending, but a new beginning, a chance to build a future on the solid ground of a past that has finally been put to rest. His aunt was gone, but her love and the lessons of her courage remained his guide. He kept only one memento from the entire ordeal, not the locket, which was returned to his mother, but a single high-quality photograph of the Subject Zero file. He had it framed and hung it in his private study, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that empires can be built on lies, that evil can wear a benevolent mask, and that power can seem absolute. But it was also a reminder that a single piece of paper, a few lines of handwritten text, left behind by a brave woman in her final terrified hours, held enough truth to bring that entire empire crashing down. It was proof that no voice is ever truly too small to matter, and that no secret, no matter how deeply it is buried, is ever truly safe from the relentless pursuit of justice. The story of Blackwood Pines serves as a stark, enduring lesson, written in concrete and bone. It teaches us that the past is never truly past. It is a living entity that breathes in the foundations of the present. It proves that truth, like a body, can be buried. It can be sealed away, hidden from the world, and left in the suffocating darkness for 30 years. But the truth does not decay. It does not rot or fade into nothingness. It simply waits. It waits with an infinite, unwavering patience for one small crack in the silence, one single ray of light, to find its way in and begin the slow, inevitable, and powerful process of resurrection.